So today I'm going to show you guys a variety of watercolor techniques that you can use and apply to a more elaborate watercolor painting. It's good to practice these techniques so you can learn how to manipulate watercolor, what materials you can add to it to change it, how you can blend colors together, how you can incorporate wet and dry watercolor paint. So this is just a little introduction. You will need a range of supplies if you want to try out the full range of things you can do with watercolor. You will need watercolors. They either come in a tube like this, and it's actually wet coming out of the tube, and you just squeeze a little bit out. A little bit of watercolor goes a long way. So just a little bit onto your palette. The nice thing about watercolor is even after it dries, you can still re-wet it and use it. So it goes a lot longer than things like acrylic paint or oil paint, where when they dry, there's nothing you can do with it anymore. They might also come in a pack like this, where you have dried little pads of watercolor. If you get one like this, what you'll do is you'll take your paintbrush, dip it in water, and add water to these little pads in order to paint with it. So when you're working with tubed watercolor, it actually comes out of the tube pretty wet, but you still want to add a little bit of water to it just to thin it out a little bit. And then when your watercolor dries, you just add water to the dried watercolor. In addition to your watercolor paints, you'll also need salt. Any sort of salt is fine. Table salt's great. Sea salt is good. The coarser salts will create bigger textures than the smaller table salts. You'll need rubbing alcohol, which I've put in a little spray bottle, masking fluid, a waterproof pen. This is an Artline drawing pen. Tissues or paper towels work well too. And I just have a pair here because we're gonna do a kind of a freestyle painting where you just get to pick whatever you want to paint. I'm just gonna do a pair for you guys today. Then you'll need a cup of water and a range of paintbrush sizes. We won't need anything too large today. Natural hair paintbrushes are typically what people use with watercolor, but I use both acrylic and natural hair. And you'll also want watercolor paper, and that's very important because if you use regular paper, the water is just going to saturate it, it's going to tear it up. So you want to have nicer, thicker watercolor paper. So I have gone ahead and labeled all of these with what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to pick them up one at a time and go through each one. So this one is wet on wet with dry. I also have a wet on wet one. So I'm going to show you wet on wet first, then I'm going to do wet on wet with dry. The wet on wet technique means that you cover your paper with water first. I'm going to do that with both of these. And then you introduce wet watercolor. Wet watercolor means you're adding a good amount of water to your paint, and then you're going to paint with it. So you're really thinning out your paint. With watercolor, the more water you add, the thinner the paint will be. The less water, the more saturated the color and the brighter the color will be. When you're working wet on wet, the watercolor will only fill the space that is wet. It will not go leach out into the dry areas, at least not if you're using a high quality watercolor paper. If you're using cheaper paper that absorbs a lot more of the water, it might spread out a little bit more. So wet on wet's just a cool way to get kind of like a feel for how the watercolor will react when you put it in the water. It'll kind of spread out, it'll fill that shape up, and you can create kind of cool tie-dye effects. So this one, I did wet on wet, but the water is already absorbed into the paper a little bit, so it's bleeding out a lot less. So I'm gonna add a little bit more water to it to encourage it to bleed a little bit more. All right, so wet on wet, easy enough. Water first, then watered down watercolor on top just to see how it bleeds together. Wet on wet and dry means you're taking a dry brush and fairly dry paint. You still have to add a little bit of water to the watercolor to get it to move, but see how different that is using just a dry brush. The color is a lot darker. It's the same exact color, but the color is a lot more saturated and a lot darker. So when I take this dry brush on the edge, I can get nice crisp lines. And when I go in to the wet on wet area, it'll start bleeding out, but I can still get some lines there. Okay, so now introducing salt to your watercolor. So I'm just gonna take my watercolor, I'm gonna add some color down, get 2 different shades of blue just for fun. And then I'm gonna take a little handful of salt and I'm gonna sprinkle it on top. And what happens is the salt absorbs the liquid, it absorbs the paint and the water, and that creates kind of this like texture, this like pebbly texture as it absorbs and it settles around the salt. What you do now is you let this totally dry, and when it's dry, you just wipe away the salt and you'll keep that speckled texture. So this is really good for sidewalks and bricks. I'll even sometimes throw it in with bushes and trees just to add a little bit of texture to my painting. All right, so masking fluid is another really cool material to use. I have already painted masking fluid on here. What you do is you just take your bottle of masking fluid, any paintbrush, paint in your shape, clean your brush immediately, because if you let that masking fluid dry on your brush, it will ruin it. So you paint your shape with masking fluid. We're gonna go in with watercolor, and the watercolor resists that area where the masking fluid was put down. So if you're doing a painting that has a lot of white space that you wanna protect, that you wanna make sure no paint stains it, then masking fluid is a great way to go. So with masking fluid, once this is dry, I'll just peel up that layer and it peels off, it has this rubbery texture, and it protects the paper, so it will just be the white of the paper when I'm done. And that is important with watercolor because you can't easily add lights back in. It's easy to build up your dark colors, but once you lose your whites, it's really difficult to lighten them back up again. So you have to plan ahead for your white space. Your waterproof pen, you can draw a design and then you can paint on top of it with your watercolor. And it won't bleed out. So you can get some cool lines that you fill in watercolor on top. When I'm doing architecture, a lot of times I will sketch out my building, kind of fill in the lines with pen and then fill it in with paint, and then I'll go back in and re-emphasize the pen marks as I need to. But it's nice to have a waterproof pen. So the Artline waterproof pen or even a permanent marker Sharpie both work really well for that technique. All right, solid color can actually be harder than you think with watercolor because it wants to move so much. So what you wanna do is start with just a dry base if you don't wanna have that like tie-dye look you do with wet on wet. And you're just gonna kind of fill in your color. So even with this is more of a gradient with the dark and going to the light. So you just kind of want to go back. So you just kind of want to smooth it out with your paintbrush, go back over it in order to get as solid a color as you want. It just takes light touches and smoothing that paint out. So glazing is a technique with watercolor where you're building layers of watercolor on top of each other. And this is the best way to get a lot of depth in your painting and to get it to look realistic. So I've already created kind of a tree base here because with each layer you want to let it dry. So when I do my paintings, a lot of times I'm putting 4 or 5 layers of paint on it, and those layers are called glazing. So you're building up your color. So I've started with kind of a brown base. So I'm going to go back in. I'm gonna go in with some darker blues for some shadows. I'm gonna go in with some greens. And you're just kind of building up your color. And with watercolor, you kind of want to work light to dark. So I have my lighter green, so I'm going to build in some shadows in here. I'm also going to take some yellows to pull out some highlights. When I paint, I never use just one color straight out of a tube. You want to always kind of combine your colors together. And this just keeps kind of building the colors up. I will add a few more layers on top of this just to emphasize those darks a little bit more, emphasize those shadows. And you can only go so far with watercolor because it will start bleeding. So my treetop would start bleeding into my trunk and my colors would start getting kind of muddy. So you want to stop before it gets too muddy, let it dry, and then go in with another layer on top. All right, blotting is a really useful technique, especially for sky and clouds. So I'm gonna fill in a section with color, and before it dries out, I'm gonna take my tissue, I'm gonna crumple it up, and I'm going to blot out a section. So you get like this clean section in your watercolor, and then I'm gonna go back in, and again, because that area is now dry, the watercolor is gonna kind of resist it, and I'm gonna pull in some shadows. And what I like about blotting is you still have a little bit of that color variation in the background because it's not gonna go all the way back to that white of the paper. So it kind of blends in. Like with clouds, you still have some of the sky color kind of going in with the cloud. So when I do skies, a lot of times I'll paint a blue base and then blot out some cloud sections. So pulling color out with the tissue. All right, so with blending, it's really similar, just trying to get a solid color. You kind of want to paint a shape. I'm going to add a little bit more dark on this side. I'm going to clean my brush off, but I'm going to keep water on it. I'm going to keep it wet, it's just going to be clean, and I'm going to kind of pull that color out just by using a damp brush. So this is kind of a good way to get even shading. I'm going to keep cleaning off my brush and then going in. So if things like that happen, I'm screwing up so you guys don't have to. Just extend your shape out a little bit further because it stains, the watercolor can stain paper pretty quickly. So if you make a mistake, just make it work with your piece. So we're just gonna have a larger shape here. And it's important to get clean water. If you're trying to get a highlight and blend into a highlight, my water is pretty blue at this point. So just switch out your water. It's worth it to take the time to do it. So just with a damp brush, I'm pulling the color that I already put down out and I'm blending it to a more three-dimensional shape because I'm adding some shadows to it. And I'm going to use my blotting technique again, and I'm just going to pull out that center and then go back in with water one more time and kind of pull that color out into an even area. So water is a really important tool in watercolor, just plain old water. All right, variegated means that you're introducing more than one color. So I'm gonna do wet on wet for this. You have to kind of go back to your color theory on this. What colors work well together? Remember, complementary colors, orange and blue, red and green, yellow and purple will make browns and grays. So if you wanna have a more vibrant color than that, if you don't wanna go into those neutral tones, then think back to your color wheel and think about what colors work well together. Yellow and blue make green, so yellow and green will make a lighter green, a more yellow green. So those work well together. You can even introduce, if you want to introduce blue as well, and kind of have blue, green, and yellow. Those colors work very well together. So variegated just means you're introducing more than one color together, letting them kind of mix together like that. All right, so to get more of a gradient look, it's similar to how I kind of started with the solid color and to how I did the blending. So I'm gonna kind of just paint a line of saturated color. I'm gonna put water on my brush and I'm just gonna pull this down to get a little bit more of a gradient shape. I'm gonna introduce a little bit more color at the top so I have more to work with. Clean off my brush and I'm gonna pull that down. So gradient means you're just going from dark to light. And paper towels and tissues are your best friend if you have any mistakes that come up while you're doing your watercolor painting, because you can easily pull that back out. Here's my gradient. All right, just regular dry brush is a great way to get clean lines. So not a very wet brush, not very wet watercolor, and you can get super clean lines. You can make very specific shapes and textures and lines with your dry brush. You can then apply that dry brush to calligraphy. Calligraphy is cursive that has thick and thin lines. Just try and write out your name. Try and see if you can get some letters or some shapes. See, make it loopy and fancy. Try pressing down in sections a little bit more and easing up in others. Calligraphy has become extremely popular over the years. This is a very practiced technique. All right. So now adding alcohol is just another way to add texture. So I'm just gonna paint kind of a block of color. I'm gonna take my spray alcohol bottle and spray it on top. So you see how it kind of interacts with the watercolor and it creates kind of a speckly texture, almost looks like a rock. So just another cool way to add texture to your watercolor. And one more fun thing to do is to splatter. You can either take your brush and splatter, do one of these guys, or you can paint a blob of color. Make sure there's a good amount of water in there, and then you angle it and blow it, and it creates kind of splatter marks like that. All right, so now that I've tested out all these different techniques, I'm gonna pull my pear out, and I'm gonna try my hand at doing just a quick little pear painting. When you start pulling different elements together, for example, I'm gonna be painting a stem that is brown with a pear that is yellow and green. So you need to plan ahead and make sure that stem is not gonna accidentally bleed into the rest of the pear. So I'm gonna start with the base of the pear, just this greenish color. And right here is where I'm gonna kind of insert my stem. So I'm already planning ahead a space for that. Watercolor is all about planning ahead. You wanna make sure you are leaving your highlights, you aren't going too dark too quick, and your colors don't accidentally bleed together if you do not want them to. So I'm gonna pull in, there's a lot of yellow here, so I'm gonna do a little bit of this variegated technique. I'm gonna do a little bit of wet on wet since I put that green down. I'm gonna introduce a little bit of darker green colors. And when I'm painting with watercolor, I often like to avoid grays and blacks and instead use purples and blues for my shadows. I just think it's more appealing, it's more interesting to look at. So I often use those colors instead. All right, so I'm gonna pull some of this bluish gray. And I'm gonna add a little bit of a shadow down here. I'm gonna add a little bit of a shadow up here. So I've blocked in those shadow areas. Now I'm going in with a clean brush so I can pull it out. I'm gonna quickly take my tissue and kind of block out some lighter areas. And remember, this is supposed to be just a quick painting. You will have time to apply these techniques to a longer, more in-depth painting. Just want to kind of try your hand at combining lots of these different techniques together. And my pear also has some really nice brown speckles. So I'm gonna pull in some of this yellow. I'm gonna add a little bit of this gray blue so I can get a darker shade here. All right, I'm gonna add a couple of these speckles using just dry. Another good technique for this is splatter, but I don't wanna have speckles splattered all over this, so I'm just gonna do plop those guys in. I'm gonna go back in with a little bit more color. And once it's a little bit more dry, I'll add a few more speckles, just so they don't bleed out as much, so they're a little bit more clean and emphasized. And if you're painting, if your paper ever gets too saturated, it might start rippling up, or it might even start to tear. And that's when you know it's time to take a break and apply those glazing techniques and come back after it's dry to add more detail. All right, so I'm gonna add my stem in. And again, I'm gonna go with more of a bluish look. I'm gonna add it into this space here. I'm gonna use a little bit of that lighter yellow to reduce that. All right, and last but not least, I'm gonna add a little bit of a shadow, and the shadow is really important because it grounds my pear. Without it, it'll just look like it's floating in space. Because my pear is so wet, I'm gonna leave a little bit of a white line between my shadow and my pear, just to make sure that my colors don't accidentally blend together. So as long as you leave a little bit of dry space, should be good to go. So here's my little freestyle pear, and here's all my testers. So try out these testers, apply it to a little quick painting, and then apply it to a larger painting. Good luck.